May 27, 1942. The basement of Building 1 at Pearl Harbor. The air hangs heavy with cigarette smoke and the metallic tang of mimeograph fluid. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort sits hunched over a desk cluttered with worksheets covered in 5-digit number groups, his bathrobe worn over his uniform against the excessive air conditioning. A coffee cup grown cold beside papers marked with penciled annotations. Around him, 24 men and women work in concentrated silence, their fingers moving across cipher tables, their eyes scanning intercepted Japanese radio transmissions for patterns invisible to ordinary observers. The clatter of typewriters punctuates the stillness. Someone coughs. A telephone rings once, then stops. In this windowless room, 72 hours removed from natural light, Rochefort circles 2 letters that have appeared with increasing frequency across dozens of enemy naval messages. AF. He does not yet know these letters designate Midway Island. He does not yet know that within days, his conclusion about their meaning will lead to the most decisive naval victory in American history. All he knows is that somewhere in the chaos of intercepted signals, in the mathematics of frequency analysis, and the intuition born from months of immersion in enemy patterns, lies the key to reading Japanese intentions. The teletypes continue their mechanical rhythm. The war continues its inexorable advance across the Pacific. And in this basement, America's most potent weapon against Japan, not the aircraft carrier, not the submarine, but the systematic breaking of enemy codes, approaches its moment of vindication. The transformation of American code-breaking from a peacetime curiosity into a decisive weapon of war did not occur through careful planning or strategic foresight. It emerged from desperation, from humiliation, from the smoking wreckage of Battleship Row on that December morning, when Japanese aircraft achieved total tactical surprise despite months of diplomatic tension. Before Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysis existed in bureaucratic shadows, underfunded and fragmented across competing military services. The Army's Signal Intelligence Service employed fewer than 24 personnel. The Navy's OP-20G section operated with comparable resources. There was no coordination between them, no shared intelligence, no recognition that the interception and decryption of enemy communications might prove as valuable as conventional arms. When Secretary of State Henry Stimson had closed the State Department's Cipher Bureau in 1929, with the declaration that gentlemen do not read each other's mail, he articulated a peculiarly American assumption about international conduct, that honorable nations operated transparently, that espionage was ungentlemanly, that the reading of diplomatic and military communications represented a moral failing rather than strategic necessity. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Japanese naval officers who designed their encryption systems in the 1930s operated under corresponding assumptions about American capabilities. They believed Western cryptanalysts could not master the complexities of Japanese language with its 3 writing systems, its contextual meanings, its fundamental difference from European linguistic structures. They believed their primary naval code, designated JN-25 by American analysts, with its tens of thousands of 5-digit code groups, each representing words or phrases, encrypted through additive cipher tables changed at irregular intervals, constituted an impenetrable barrier to enemy understanding. They believed Americans lacked the patience and intellectual discipline required for cryptanalysis. The months of painstaking work recording intercepts, building frequency tables, testing hypotheses against accumulated data, the willingness to spend weeks pursuing patterns that might lead nowhere. Japanese confidence in their communication security was not mere arrogance. Their codes were genuinely sophisticated, their cipher procedures complex, their transmission discipline generally good. What they failed to anticipate was the industrial and organizational capacity America would bring to the problem once code-breaking became a national priority. The attack on Pearl Harbor represented not only a tactical surprise, but an intelligence failure of profound dimensions. American cryptanalysts had made significant progress against Japanese diplomatic codes. The machine cipher designated Purple had been solved in 1940 through brilliant mathematical analysis by a team led by William Friedman, who suffered a nervous breakdown from the sustained mental effort. Throughout 1941, American officials had read Japanese diplomatic traffic, understanding Tokyo's growing frustration with American oil embargoes and diplomatic pressure. What they could not read were Japanese military codes, particularly the naval operational codes that would have revealed the planned attack on Hawaii. The result was catastrophe. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, nearly 250 aircraft destroyed, over 2,000 Americans dead. The Japanese had achieved complete operational surprise despite months of preparation, despite the movement of a carrier strike force across thousands of miles of ocean, despite the diplomatic indicators that war was imminent. The failure was comprehensive, and from that failure came transformation. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, American code-breaking underwent revolution. Resources that had been denied for years suddenly became available. Personnel expanded from dozens to hundreds, then thousands. The Navy established the Communications Intelligence Organization, centralizing efforts that had been scattered across different offices. Commander Rochefort's Combat Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor, designated Station HYPO, received priority status and expanded operations. On the mainland, Station NEGAT in Washington and Station CAST in the Philippines, later relocated to Melbourne, formed a network of intercept and analysis stations working around the clock. The Army's operation at Arlington Hall began recruiting mathematicians, linguists, and chess players, anyone whose mind worked in patterns and probabilities. Women joined in increasing numbers, bringing skills in language and analysis that proved crucial. What had been a neglected backwater of military intelligence became a priority effort consuming thousands of personnel and significant resources. The transformation occurred with remarkable speed, driven by the recognition that America had been fighting blind and could not afford to do so any longer. Yet resources alone could not break codes. The work required something more fundamental, a particular cast of mind, a willingness to pursue patterns across thousands of messages, to test hypotheses and discard them when they failed, to maintain focus through months of incremental progress. The codebreakers who gathered at Pearl Harbor and Washington and Melbourne were not conventional military officers. Many were reservists, academics in uniform, drawn from university mathematics and linguistics departments. They worked irregular hours, ignored military protocol, dressed casually, and operated in an atmosphere of intellectual intensity foreign to regular military operations. Rochefort's basement at Pearl Harbor became legendary for its unconventional atmosphere. Officers working in bathrobes and slippers, chain-smoking through 72-hour shifts, sustained by coffee and the conviction that somewhere in the accumulating intercepts lay the information that could shift the course of the war. The work was tedious beyond description. A single intercepted message might contain 200 5-digit code groups. Each group had to be looked up in incomplete code books painstakingly reconstructed through frequency analysis and context. Many groups remained unsolved. A message that took 30 seconds to transmit might require hours to partially decrypt and days to fully understand. Progress came in fragments, a recovered word here, a partially solved group there, gradual accumulation of knowledge about how the Japanese structured their communications. The symbolic object that came to represent this effort was not a weapon or a flag, but the IBM punch card tabulating machine. Before the war, these machines had been used for census data and business accounting. Adapted for cryptanalysis, they became instruments of pattern recognition, capable of comparing thousands of code groups against frequency tables, identifying correlations invisible to human analysis. The mechanical sorting of punch cards, the clatter of the tabulator's processing data, became the sound of American industrial capacity applied to intellectual problems. Where Japanese cryptanalysts worked manually, American codebreakers employed mechanical computation. Where Japanese code systems assumed human limitations in pattern recognition, American operations exceeded those limitations through technology. The punch card machines were not intelligent. They simply sorted and counted with mechanical precision, but applied systematically to vast quantities of intercepted data, they revealed structures and patterns that manual analysis would never find. This marriage of human intuition and mechanical processing represented something fundamentally American: the application of industrial methods to intellectual work, the belief that difficult problems yielded to systematic effort and technological tools. By the spring of 1942, Station HYPO had achieved partial penetration of JN-25, the Japanese Naval Operational Code. The breakthrough was not complete. Perhaps 15 to 20% of code groups could be read with confidence. Another 20% could be guessed from context. The remainder stayed opaque. But even partial penetration of enemy operational codes provided intelligence of extraordinary value. American commanders gained insight into Japanese ship movements, fleet dispositions, planned operations. The intelligence was fragmentary, often ambiguous, requiring careful analysis to distinguish genuine operational plans from deception or routine communications. Yet it was infinitely superior to operational blindness. In April 1942, intercepted messages revealed Japanese plans for a major operation in the Coral Sea. American carriers positioned to intercept. The resulting battle was tactically inconclusive. Both sides lost carriers, but strategically it marked the first check to Japanese expansion. More importantly, it validated the cryptanalytic effort. Intelligence derived from code-breaking had provided operational warning that enabled American forces to contest Japanese moves. Then came the intercepts that would vindicate everything. In early May 1942, Station HYPO detected unusual message traffic indicating preparations for a major operation. The target was designated by two letters: AF. Rochefort's team believed AF indicated Midway Island, the American outpost northwest of Hawaii, but they could not be certain. Other analysts argued AF might designate Hawaii itself, or the Aleutian Islands, or some other target. The debate was not academic. American carriers and the entire course of the Pacific War might turn on correct interpretation. Rochefort proposed a deception. He arranged for Midway to transmit an uncoded message reporting that its water distillation plant had broken down. Days later, Japanese intercepts reported that AF was short of fresh water. The identification was confirmed. AF was Midway. The Japanese were planning an assault on the island with the full strength of their combined fleet, including 4 heavy carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Admiral Nimitz, commander of Pacific forces, faced a decision that would determine whether the war could be won or lost. He could accept the intelligence and position his carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet, risking everything on the accuracy of code-breaking. Or he could dismiss the intelligence as unreliable and deploy his forces conventionally, in which case the Japanese would likely achieve surprise and destroy Midway's defenses before American forces could respond. Nimitz chose to trust the codebreakers. He positioned 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, where they could strike the Japanese fleet while it was committed to attacking the island. The decision represented extraordinary confidence in intelligence derived from partially broken codes, from analysis of fragmentary intercepts, from the judgment of unconventional officers working in basement rooms far from combat. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese carriers launched their attack on Midway while American carriers approached from the northeast, their presence unknown to Japanese commanders who believed the American fleet was still near Hawaii. What followed was the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers with their decks crowded with refueling aircraft. Within minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were burning wrecks. A 4th was destroyed later that day. Japanese naval aviation, the elite force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, lost its offensive power in a single morning. The Battle of Midway was won before the first bomb fell, won in the basement rooms where codebreakers had pierced Japanese communications security, won through the systematic application of cryptanalytic methods that transformed intercepted signals into actionable intelligence. The Japanese naval officers who survived Midway returned to their bases in shock. They had expected to achieve tactical surprise, to catch American forces unprepared, to destroy Midway's defenses and draw American carriers into a decisive engagement on Japanese terms. Instead, they had sailed into an ambush. American carriers had been positioned with uncanny precision, waiting in exactly the right location to launch devastating attacks. How had the Americans known? Japanese communication security was reviewed. Transmission procedures were tightened. Code books were changed more frequently. Yet the suspicion remained, unarticulated but growing, that somehow American intelligence was reading Japanese naval communications. The psychological impact of this realization, gradual, incomplete, but increasingly unavoidable, proved as damaging as the material losses. Japanese commanders could no longer plan operations with confidence that their preparations remained secret. Every major movement, every concentration of forces, every operational order transmitted by radio might be known to the enemy. The fundamental assumption of military planning, that one's own intentions remain concealed until revealed through action, had been compromised. War conducted without communication security became war conducted in transparency. Each side's moves visible to the opponent. For an island empire dependent on naval operations across vast ocean distances, dependent on radio communications to coordinate far-flung forces, this transparency was crippling. American cryptanalytic success at Midway established code-breaking as an operational priority. Resources continued to expand. By 1943, OP-20G employed over 4,000 personnel. Arlington Hall's operation grew even larger. Intercept stations were established across the Pacific and along the West Coast, their antenna arrays listening continuously for Japanese transmissions. The volume of intercepted traffic became overwhelming, thousands of messages daily, each requiring processing, each potentially containing information of operational value. The IBM tabulating machines worked around the clock, processing punch cards, generating frequency analyses, identifying code group patterns. Human analysts worked in shifts, comparing intercepted messages against partially reconstructed code books, testing hypotheses, building understanding of Japanese communications practices. The work remained tedious, the progress incremental, but the system functioned with increasing efficiency. What had been improvised after Pearl Harbor became institutionalized, bureaucratized, systematic. The intelligence derived from code-breaking, designated Ultra in the Pacific, shaped every major American operation. When Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, undertook an inspection tour of forward bases in April 1943, American codebreakers read the exact details of his itinerary: dates, locations, aircraft type, departure and arrival times. The information reached Washington, where a fateful decision was made. Yamamoto could be intercepted and killed. The operation would risk revealing that American intelligence was reading Japanese codes, but Yamamoto's strategic importance made the risk acceptable. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport over Bougainville and shot it down. The architect of Pearl Harbor died in the jungle. Japanese naval leadership was stunned. How had American fighters known exactly when and where to intercept? The coincidence seemed impossible, yet the alternative explanation, that American cryptanalysts had read the itinerary, was almost too disturbing to contemplate. Japanese code systems were reviewed again, additional security measures implemented, but the fundamental vulnerability remained. Submarine operations in the Pacific depended almost entirely on cryptanalytic intelligence. American submarines operating alone in vast ocean spaces needed to know where Japanese merchant shipping would be, the convoy routes, the schedules, the escort arrangements. Without such intelligence, submarines would patrol blindly, relying on chance encounters. With intelligence derived from broken codes, submarines could be positioned along known shipping routes, could intercept specific convoys, could avoid areas with strong Japanese anti-submarine presence. The results were devastating. Japanese merchant shipping losses climbed steadily throughout 1943 and 1944. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies were torpedoed before reaching Japan. Freighters loaded with raw materials were sunk in the South China Sea. Transport ships carrying troops and supplies to island garrisons went down with their cargoes. By 1944, Japan's maritime supply lines were collapsing. The home islands began to starve for resources. Factories lacked raw materials. The population faced food shortages. An island empire dependent on maritime trade was being strangled by submarine warfare guided by cryptanalytic intelligence. The punch card tabulators at Arlington Hall, processing intercepted Japanese merchant shipping schedules, were as effective at destroying Japanese logistics as torpedoes were at sinking ships. The German cryptanalysts who worked on Japanese codes, Germany and Japan, shared some cryptographic information as allies, recognized that Japanese naval codes had been compromised. They warned their Japanese counterparts that American code-breaking capabilities appeared far more advanced than anticipated. Japanese cryptographers acknowledged the warnings but faced an impossible dilemma. Completely replacing the naval code system would require months of preparation, would disrupt operations during the transition, and offered no guarantee that the replacement system would prove more secure. Partial measures, changing code books more frequently, altering additive tables, improving transmission security, might provide incremental improvement but could not restore confidence in communication security. The fundamental problem was structural. Japanese military operations depended on radio communications across vast distances. Those communications could be intercepted. Once intercepted, they became subject to cryptanalysis. And American cryptanalytic capabilities, supported by industrial resources and technological tools Japanese could not match, proved capable of penetrating codes that had been designed as unbreakable. The psychological burden of operating without communications security weighed on Japanese commanders throughout 1943 and 1944. Plans were compromised before execution. Movements were detected before completion. The Americans seemed always to know, always to anticipate, always to position their forces with precision that suggested foreknowledge. And indeed, they did know. The codebreakers were reading Japanese intentions almost in real time. By 1945, American cryptanalytic operations had achieved something close to total penetration of Japanese military communications. Not every message could be read. Some codes remained partially secure. Some transmissions were garbled or incomplete. Some operational details stayed unclear. But the overall picture of Japanese military activity was visible to American intelligence with remarkable clarity. When Japan prepared defensive plans for the home islands in anticipation of American invasion, American codebreakers read the details, unit dispositions, fortification plans, strategic priorities. When Japanese commanders debated surrender terms after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American intelligence followed the debates through intercepted and decrypted diplomatic traffic. The reading of Japanese communications provided insight not only into military dispositions, but into Japanese thinking, into the debates within the government about continuing the war, into the conditions under which Japan might accept surrender. This intelligence informed American decisions about targeting, about invasion planning, about the terms of surrender that might be acceptable to Japanese leadership. The war ended not only because of military defeat, but because Japanese leaders concluded that further resistance was futile, a conclusion shaped in part by the realization, incomplete but growing, that their communications had been compromised and their strategic position was transparent to the enemy. The officers and enlisted personnel who worked in the cryptanalytic centers, the women who operated the IBM machines at Arlington Hall, the linguists who translated decrypted messages, the mathematicians who developed new analytical techniques, the junior officers who spent thousands of hours building code books from fragments. These individuals fought the war with pencils and worksheets rather than rifles and grenades. Their contributions remained invisible during the war years. Communications intelligence was among the most closely guarded secrets of the conflict. Personnel who worked in cryptanalysis signed secrecy agreements prohibiting disclosure for decades after the war. Families did not know what their husbands or wives or children did during those years. The public narrative of American victory emphasized material superiority, the production of ships and aircraft and tanks in quantities that overwhelmed Axis forces. This narrative was true but incomplete. Material superiority was amplified by information superiority. American forces fought with eyes open, with knowledge of enemy intentions, with intelligence derived from the systematic breaking of enemy codes. The battles were won by Marines and soldiers and sailors, but those forces were positioned and supplied and directed using intelligence that gave American commanders advantages approaching precognition. The transformation of codebreaking from a peacetime curiosity into a decisive weapon reflected broader changes in how America approached war. The traditional American way of war emphasized material abundance, industrial production, overwhelming force applied through superior resources. This approach remained central. American factories outproduced Axis nations in every category of military equipment. But alongside material abundance came information abundance. The massive expansion of cryptanalytic operations, the thousands of personnel dedicated to signals intelligence, the application of mechanical computation to code breaking, the systematic collection and analysis of intercepted communications. These efforts represented the industrialization of intelligence. Where European powers had long maintained professional intelligence services, America had entered the war with intelligence capabilities that were fragmented and underfunded. By 1945, American intelligence operations had surpassed those of any other nation, not through superior espionage or traditional intelligence craft, but through the application of resources, technology, and systematic methods to the problem of understanding enemy intentions. The IBM punch card machines clattering away in Arlington Hall, processing millions of cipher groups, represented a uniquely American approach to intelligence. The belief that difficult problems yielded to systematic effort, that technology could amplify human capability, that information warfare could be conducted with industrial methods. The Japanese military analysts who examined their defeat in the years after surrender identified communication security as among their greatest failures. They had underestimated American cryptanalytic capabilities. They had maintained confidence in code systems that had been compromised. They had continued to transmit operationally sensitive information by radio long after security had been lost. The consequences were strategic. Operations planned in secrecy became known to the enemy. Movements intended to achieve surprise were detected before completion. The psychological burden of fighting an enemy who seemed always to anticipate, always to know, contributed to the sense of hopelessness that characterized the final year of the war. In retrospect, Japanese commanders recognized that they had fought much of the war in transparency, their intentions visible to American intelligence while American intentions remained opaque. This asymmetry of information proved as decisive as asymmetries of industrial production or material resources. An empire could not fight effectively when its communications were being read by the enemy. The symbolism of the punch card machine, that mechanical sorter of data, that industrial tool adapted for intellectual work, represented something profound about American power in the 20th century. Military victory came not only from tanks and ships, but from the systematic application of technology to information. The codebreakers who operated those machines, who fed punch cards into mechanical sorters and analyzed the output, were conducting a new kind of warfare. They fought with mathematics and probability theory, with frequency analysis and pattern recognition, with the conviction that enemy codes could be broken through sustained effort and systematic methods. The clatter of the tabulating machines, working through the night shifts, processing intercepted data, represented a sound as important to victory as the sound of bombers overhead or artillery in the distance. It was the sound of information being weaponized, of industrial capacity applied to intellectual problems, of American abundance expressed not through material goods, but through information dominance. The story of American code-breaking in World War II is ultimately a story about transformation. The transformation of a neglected backwater of military intelligence into a decisive instrument of war. The transformation of academic mathematicians and linguists into warriors fighting with pencils and worksheets. The transformation of mechanical business machines into weapons that shape the course of battles. It is also a story about what happens when a democracy mobilizes its full resources against totalitarian adversaries. The Japanese had assumed Americans lacked the patience and discipline for cryptanalytic work. The Germans had assumed their Enigma machines were unbreakable. Both assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. Americans brought to code-breaking the same industrial and organizational capacity they brought to aircraft production and shipbuilding, the belief that difficult problems yielded to resources, technology, and systematic effort. The thousands of personnel working in cryptanalytic operations, the IBM machines processing millions of punch cards, the intercept stations listening continuously for enemy transmissions, represented democracy at war, mobilizing not only its material resources, but its intellectual resources, its technological resources, its organizational capacity to solve complex problems through collective effort. In that basement room at Pearl Harbor, where Joseph Rochefort worked through the spring of 1942, the clatter of typewriters and the mechanical rhythm of teletypes represented something more than office sounds. They represented the sound of American power, of industrial democracy applied to warfare, of the conviction that wars could be won not only through courage and sacrifice, but through knowledge and understanding. The intercepted messages, the worksheets covered in cipher groups, the IBM machines sorting punch cards, these were the instruments through which America fought a war of information, a war of patterns and probabilities, a war that was won in basement rooms before it was won on distant battlefields. And when the war ended, when Japanese officials signed surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, they surrendered not only to American military power, but to American information dominance, to the recognition that they had fought the last 2 years of the war in transparency, while their enemy moved in secrecy. The codebreakers had turned information into a weapon, and that weapon, wielded with systematic precision, had proved as decisive as any bomb or bullet in the arsenal of democracy.